Welcome in to Jags Now, presented by our wonderful friends over at Prize Picks. On today's show, there's a lot of news surrounding the Jacksonville Jaguars, as you can tell by the thumbnail of this video. Some NFL news that I think could pertain to the Jacksonville Jaguars. It's probably unlikely, but I at least wanted to discuss the possibility here as we sit towards the end of July. Also, the Jaguars placed two players on the PUP list ahead of the training camp portion of this offseason period. We'll tell you who those two players are here in just a moment. And also, the Jaguars worked out a familiar face today, and could he be a potential addition for this Jaguars roster? All that and more coming up on this episode of Jags Now. But guys, this is why you subscribe. July 27th, we are still bringing you guys content here. It's going to be pretty late here on the East Coast by the time this video gets out, but we are dedicated to bringing you guys the content around the Jacksonville Jaguars. And if you enjoy talking about your Jacksonville Jaguars, hit that subscribe button, because as we get into not only training camp, preseason, but when the real football is back, we're all going to have you guys covered here at the channel, so make sure you hit that sub button. All right, so it was originally reported, I want to say it was Mike Garafolo of NFL Network. He reported that Vita Vea, the Buccaneers defensive tackle, has requested a trade ahead of the 2026 NFL season. He's entering the final year of his deal, and a lot of people are wondering, which teams could be interested, which teams could be involved. Let me just say this from the get-go. I don't necessarily think the Jaguars are a team that's going to be heavily considering trading for Vita Vea. I don't think it's realistic. Money-wise, it would be pretty tough to make possible, but I at least wanted to discuss the possibility on today's show, so that's what we're going to do. So Vita Vea, just to kind of give you guys a brief rundown, he does turn 31 years old this upcoming season. He's coming off a year where he had 4.5 sacks, he had 13 quarterback hits, 7 tackles for loss, 34 total tackles. Not his most impressive statistical year, but if the Jaguars, for whatever reason, and I don't think that they do think this, by the way, if the Jaguars, for whatever reason, thought, hey, why don't we give this a shot in terms of really going into adding a proven defensive line piece into our rotation, it would obviously probably involve maybe Devon Hamilton potentially being moved, but I don't necessarily know if the Jaguars even want to do that. Could the Jaguars theoretically make this possible? So the Jaguars, as of this current moment, according to Over the Cap, are just over a little over $8 million in cap space. Now, Vita Vea, if he's traded, I'm pulling this up post June 1st. So Vita Vea, if he's traded, any team, Jaguars or anybody else that would incur Vita Vea's salary, they would incur his entire base salary of $17 million. He doesn't have any signing bonus, at least from what I'm understanding here. And if you were to inquire Vita Vea, could, a team, if the Buccaneers were looking to pivot off of him, they could potentially talk about a team looking to take some of his salary. I don't think a team is doing that at this stage in his career. But could Vita Vea be on the horizon for the Jaguars? Well, the Jags would have to make some moves as well. I mean, they could give him an extension, which if the Jaguars gave Vita Vea an extension if they were to trade for him, again, I don't think this would happen, but it would free up roughly about $12.5 million of savings. Now, the Jags inquiring all this money potentially, now that's up to 12, obviously, million, depending on the extension amount. The Jaguars would also have to look to potentially moving off of someone on the defensive line. I think it would personally be Devon Hamilton. Now, you would incur a dead cap hit of $4 million, while cap savings of 8.4 roughly million. Me personally, guys, I don't really see a world where the Jaguars personally make this move. I think Vita Vea is still a really, heck of a talent. He's one of the better defensive tackles, I think, of his draft class and of his generation. He's a former 2-time Pro Bowler, but I don't think it really makes a lot of sense from the Jaguars perspective. And we're going to talk more about that here on the back half of today's show. But before we get to our wonderful friends over at Prize Picks, I want to ask you guys, should the Jaguars trade for Vita Vea? Let me know just by typing trade or pass down below in the comments section. And guys, we would not be able to do this episode of Jags Now presented by our friends over at Prize Picks if it wasn't for our friends over at Prize Picks. So let's give them some love here. Today's show is sponsored by Prize Picks, America's #1 sports picks app. Baseball is well underway, along with a ton of other sports that you can cash in with on Prize Picks. Football is right around the corner, so you make sure that you're locked in with Prize Picks, because it's the best place to win cash while watching sports. Prize Picks available in most states, including California, Texas, and Florida. And you guys can even follow me on the app to see all my picks at CullenBro21, including this 3-player season-long football lineup that I've got for you guys. Omarion Hampton, give me the more on his rushing yards. Brian Thomas Jr., give me the more on his receiving yards. I think he has a bounce-back year this year. And then Caleb Williams, I do think, becomes the first Chicago Bears quarterback to hit 4,000 passing yards. Give me the more on his passing yards. And guys, there's a new user offer in case you didn't already know. Play your first $5 lineup, and you can get $150 in your lineup if you win that initial $5 lineup. New user offer alert. Just use code HMA when you sign up. That's right. Prize Picks just switched up their offer, so there's no better time to join. Lock in and win that first lineup. That's code HMA at sign up to get $150 in bonus lineups if you win your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, code HMA. Download the app now. Thank you, Prize Picks, for sponsoring this episode of Jags Now. All right, getting back into just the Vita Vea talk, and then we'll talk more about the 2 pup players for the Jacksonville Jaguars, and also an interesting workout visit as well. To me, this just doesn't really make sense. I think the Jaguars, from a defensive line, and especially from an interior perspective, I think they're comfortable with where their defensive line is at. You have Eric Armstead, who you think will have a bounce-back-ish season. I don't think he's going to ever quite be back to peak form, Eric Armstead, but he did in the year last year kind of hurt on his hand and didn't have quite his best stuff, but I still think he can be a productive pass rusher for you at the NFL level. You also have Devon Hamilton, who I think is one of the more underrated run defenders in the National Football League. To be honest, if I'm kind of just looking at it from an unbiased perspective, I don't see a world where it would make sense for the Jaguars to really pivot off of Devon Hamilton, just kind of the character guy he is and overall what he's meant to Jacksonville. I don't think it would make sense to move off from Vita Vea, but he would be, I think, the name that the Jaguars would look to move on in a hypothetical scenario, but I just want to throw his name out. And then you've got Albert Regis and then Rook Aroro as kind of your initial wave, and we'll see if Rook can kind of have a resurgence at this point in his career. He's still on his rookie contract after things didn't work out for him in Atlanta. He'll back up Eric Armstead, and then Albert Regis is set to be the kind of nose tackle of the future there behind Devon Hamilton. So don't really think it's necessarily going to be likely that the Jaguars look to trade for Vita Vea, but it is some NFL news that, if James Gladstone, we've kind of said it before, like it wouldn't have made sense for him to necessarily trade for Max Crosby financially. There was a rumor from Diana Rossini that they at least inquired about it. I'm not saying that we're fully in on the conversations with teams like Baltimore and whatever, and the Cowboys, but they did technically inquire. It wouldn't shock me if James Gladstone at least made a phone call to Tampa Bay and Jason Light and the organization. So just kind of wanted to throw my 2 cents out there in terms of Vita Vea. Now getting into the news that was reported over the weekend, as the Jaguars had placed both Garrett DiGiorgio, I apologize if I butchered that name, and Colvin Lanen on the physically unable to perform list, aka the PUP list, ahead of training camp. So we'll spend most of the time on Van Lanen, as although Garrett DiGiorgio is probably going to be a guy that's fighting for rush spot. I'm not sure how likely it is he makes it, but could be a potential practice squad candidate. For Colvin Lanen and for any player that's put on the PUP list this time of year, because you're going to see a lot of different teams put guys on PUP. If you're not aware, any player that goes on the PUP list during this point of training camp, they are at no point guaranteed to miss any time of the regular season. It's only to the point where if it gets to where the teams have to make their roster cut down to the final 53, if a player is still designated for the PUP at that point, that is when they miss the first 4 weeks of the season before they kind of start ramping up that practice period and see if they can ultimately get back into the swing of things into their rotation at their respective positions. So I think this is an interesting kind of development. Liam Coen kind of had an update saying that he felt great in terms of where Colvin Lanen is at. And not that you would expect anything else from Liam Coen at this stage, but in terms of saying anything. But I do kind of want to just keep an eye on this in terms of his overall progression, because it felt like the Jaguars were leaning towards, he could be back at some point in training camp, which he still could be. But, the closer we get to the season, the closer we get to that point where the 53-man roster cut down date gets to, that's when you were, as a Jaguars fan, it's like, all right, this guy played so many different spots for us on the offensive line last year, and they gave him this extension towards the end of the year, a 3-year deal to kind of lock him in and be your left tackle of the future. How is that knee injury, right? And, is he going to be able to in theory, at least be healthy going into week 1 when you're going up against the Cleveland Browns and Jared Verse in the crew. I almost said Myles Garrett there, but Jared Verse is not going to be an easy matchup for whether it's Cole Van Lanen or, potentially Walker Little, who would presumably step up in that spot. Does this potentially mean that Shuma Adoga could potentially make the 53-man roster if Cole Van Lanen is on the PUP list to start the year? There's a lot of potential ways things could go, but just from an initial perspective, Van Lanen is not, at least at this point, guaranteed to miss any time in the regular season, which is kind of the main point I wanted to get across there. And that's something good for Jaguars fans. It's also good that players that have dealt with injuries throughout the offseason period, such as obviously Travis Hunter coming back from that LCL injury. He was not put on the PUP list. He's looking like he's ramping up to go. Ran, 22 miles per hour the other day, which is insane, but can't wait to see what he looks like in year 2. You obviously Chris Rodriguez going through his kind of foot thing. He wasn't put on the PUP list. So, and then some other Jaguars players, obviously, that have been kind of dealt with some injuries throughout camp. None of those guys were put on the PUP list either. So good sign from that regard as well. But yeah, Cole Van Lanen is definitely the name that I'm keeping an eye on, and just in terms of like, hey, are we getting any updates? Are we getting any progression on the Jaguars left tackle? That's obviously a worth note there. And then finally, a familiar face has a workout with the or a visit, I should say, with the Jacksonville Jaguars, and that is none other than Zay Jones, who spent 2 seasons with the Jaguars early in his career. Could he potentially be looking to head back for Jacksonville? They had a visit on Monday per the NFL's transactional report. And then he played with the Jags, obviously, back in 2022, 2023. In his time, had a decent 2-year stretch, had 116 catches for 1,144 yards and 7 touchdowns. So nothing in terms of production there. And he spent his last 2 seasons with the Arizona Cardinals, where he's just been kind of at the end of their roster. Only caught 20 passes for 267 yards. And this is kind of interesting just in terms of like, okay, if you're a Jaguars, fan perspective on this, Zay Jones, right, would be coming in as a receiver. If you're looking at the receiving core, obviously you still have the main 3 in BTJ. You have Parker Washington, Jacoby Myers, no particular order. Travis Hunter will give you some offensive snaps, but you can't really pencil him in as just a full-time receiver because obviously he's got to give you snaps at cornerback. And then you have your 2 rookies in CJ Williams and Josh Cameron, who are expected to, I would say, have a good track in terms of if they perform well in training camp, make this team from a roster perspective. So that's 5, 6 if you want to count Travis Hunter. So to potentially bring in a guy like Zay Jones, do the Jaguars maybe want to have some potential insurance in case, for whatever reason, they just want an extra body in camp, or could this be something more? I kind of look at this as just like, hey, it's a visit. They haven't even signed him yet, so I'm not going to completely overreact or dive too much into it, but it is worth noting. I just thought it was a cool, interesting note that the Jaguars did have Zay Jones for a visit, and obviously there's some ties there. Could Zay Jones be on his way back to Jacksonville? I mean, obviously at this point, he's not going to be much of a contributing factor. I think his even best days are behind him back in 22-23, but you never know. Liam Coen tends to bring out the best of people, right? So this could be a very interesting angle for the Jaguars, but that is going to conclude this episode of Jags Now. Again, just wanted to explore the Vita Vea stuff. I don't think the Jaguars are going to be somebody that looks to trade for Vita Vea, but in the event that they do, they would have to – there's a lot of financial hurdles that they would have to hurdle through, for lack of a better term, to get Vita Vea. Obviously, Van Lanen and DiGiorgio put on PUP, and then the Jaguars had Zay Jones in for a visit. So that is going to conclude this episode of Jags Now, presented by our wonderful friends at Prize Picks. Again, guys, hit that subscribe button, lock us in for all things Jacksonville Jaguars. We're getting ramped up into training camp and the rest of preseason. The offseason's coming to a close, guys, and regular season football will be here before you know it. You're not going to miss out. Hit that subscribe button. Until next time, Jags fans, we'll see you on the next one.